So we've already spent almost 2 weeks on Acts 20, but I do just want to go ahead and finish it real quick because I felt like we kind of left it a little open-ended. So we've been in Acts 20 for a while because of the topic and conversation about shepherds. And so if this is your first time with us, we have recently started a class a few weeks ago on looking at specifically New Testament passages that relate to leaders and elders and shepherds and bishops and presbyters and all the words used to categorize leaders in the New Testament. And so we've been looking at some passages. We talked early on in the first few weeks that realistically, especially in the New Testament early on, function preceded title. And that's still somewhat the case, but meaning that you were called specifically to do something, you were asked to do something, and that was why you were maybe, whatever word you want to use, you were affirmed or invited to lead on this specific account. And so we talked a little bit about that, especially in some of the early passages and pastoral letters of Paul, like 1 Thessalonians and other written material that's early on in the church. So now we're kind of moving our way along the New Testament, and we were in Acts 20, and so we'll spend quickly amount of time there, and then we're going to get into, for the next few weeks, except for next week, so next week, just to highlight this, make an announcement about this, next week we're going to actually introduce the elder selection process in the classroom, and it will be more of a, just because there's a lot to discuss, but there'll be more of a lecture based, but then we'll invite questions for the coming weeks because the process itself won't really get started until the end of summer because we want everybody back from all the traveling to participate in that. So it's really not that far away if you think about it, maybe a month out. And so we're thinking and praying and reflecting for our church in this new season of leadership. And so be mindful of that for next Sunday, August 9th in class, a combined adult class for that. So if you want to, you can turn to Acts 20 real quickly. We'll be there briefly. And then we're going to get into Titus and Timothy for the next couple weeks. So we'll talk, generally speaking, it'll be like a huge macro 50,000-foot version of Titus, Timothy passages today. And then we'll get into more specific readings of the text after August 9th and see what Paul is up to with those church leaders. Okay, so Acts 20, the shepherd metaphor that's used throughout Scripture, both the New Testament and Old Testament. The first point is the shepherd's task is to be shepherds of the flock. That seems pretty obvious. But what that means maybe is there's probably two main roles or ideas that related to this. One is herding and one is feeding. Okay? So verse 9 indicates that the shepherd's task will be to protect herding the flock from wolves that threaten. The image of wolves points to false teaching, and we'll get into false teaching and false prophets and all that, especially when we get into Timothy and Titus. And let me just say this, I think it's specific enough in the sense where that false teachers are infiltrating local churches and are causing some mayhem and some division and dysfunction. But I think there is some differences enough where how that's happening in 1 Timothy might be a little subtly different than what's happening in Titus, what's happening in Galatians, what's happening in Acts. And so we're going to look at that because I think if you look at it from the big picture, what does that mean for us is, okay, so what does false teaching look like for us today is probably the more important question. And so for the sake of leaders, what are leaders supposed to do today to respond to quote-unquote false teaching? And so we all have our ideas on that, and that's good, and we also need to use what the text is saying to discern exactly what's going on here. The emphasis on herding and feeding, you don't need to use this text, but maybe just write it down, is especially evident in Ezekiel. And so Ezekiel uses a lot of shepherding passages. In chapter 34 especially, around, I'd say 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, kind of in that area, you'll find that God especially takes the role of shepherd. And so we see God, even himself, sees himself as shepherd. Jesus' description, we know this one, right? Jesus is described as what? The good shepherd. And that's John chapter 10. And so that is another dimension, and especially for that particular text, I think the main message for that is the good shepherd is a selfless shepherd. Thinks about all the world, empties himself, sacrifices himself for the sake of others, which I think is one of the main points even in Acts 20, maybe one of the main roles of a shepherd. Okay, so I think we've already discussed a little bit about maybe what we think a shepherd should be. We think a shepherd should be what? Selfless instead of self-serving, a servant, and all those ideas. But what about the hurting dimension? Meaning, Paul describes them, verse 28 of Acts 20, as overseers, as leaders, as episcopes, commonly translated as bishops, translated as supervisor. So it was the common term in secular life for a supervisor to work a field. That was very common language, that a supervisor would work a field. And so this passage also suggests that there is an authoritative role of shepherds and elders. What do you think about that? What kind of authority do local church elders and shepherds have? Okay, so approachable, and then not only are they approachable, we use the word loving, so maybe there's like a listening spirit to them, a caring spirit, but also confident, right? So, I mean, I don't expect you to, when I come talk to you, I don't expect you to agree with me, right? But how you respond to me in that disagreement is just as important as how you respond to me in our agreements. And so there's a character there that needs, and so that's important. So she brought up, especially when, for an individual, when she goes up to a shepherd, she wants somebody who's caring, compassionate, listening, attentive, all those different aspects that would be somebody good. Sure. Good. Okay. So, Joe, did I cut you off first, Joe? Did I cut you off? Okay. So Joe was saying, I'm trying to do better about repeating myself since I am on video and someone called me out. And I listened, by the way, in a compassionate way. Say, hey, I don't always hear the questions. So bear with me. So Joe just said about the supervisor. He brought up the supervisor role in a field. And a supervisor has a job to get done. I mean, they got goals, they got to, I mean, if they don't get their job done, they're no longer the supervisor, right? And so they rally the people with them to help get that job done. And so the supervisory role for a shepherd could be that the job is to ensure that people within the local flock are following life with God. And so the shepherd supervises and oversees the faithful life of Christians. Okay? So when does authority play into that? If part of their job is to oversee your faithful living. Yeah, Larry?
Authority can be based on two different things.
Okay.
Either a power position of the individual or those under that individual deeding the supervisor as authoritative.
Okay, so
It's a two-part relationship.
it's a two-part relationship. One part is the authority, the power position, and then the other part is follower? The person who's...
I don't like that word because it's too loose. I like the word deed simply because it implies that there is some sort of a thought process, a contractual process, process wherein I say in myself, this is my commitment to that individual.
Okay, so there's a certain level of obligation that one has in following a leader. Obviously...
No, it's a choice.
Okay.
I can be demanded to do this work, and I will do it for whatever the reward is. Or I can do the work out of respect because I have committed because of the higher authority. I may not respect the individual, but I respect the person or
The position itself. Yeah.
position itself or the individual above.
Yeah, so it's multi-layered. I mean, because we want to, as a church, not only maintain the integrity of the person who is an elder, but maintain the integrity of the position of eldering. And what we don't recognize sometimes is, in fact, if we actually lose respect or integrity of the individual, that actually slowly creeps in and could create toxic situations where you actually don't even respect and value the role of eldering in general. And some may disagree with me, but that's okay, because I know I'm right on that. John. Yeah, did you raise your hand, or was there somebody else?
Yeah, I was going to say, quite frequently we had a minister back in a previous congregation named Floyd Bradshaw, and when he would get up, he was very thought-provoking, and he would, without even saying anything to the people, he would cause many, many people to do self-introspection just by what he said. So an elder, and he was an elder who, whether somebody comes to them or whether they're in the pulpit or whether in a classroom or whatever, if they can cause people to think, and he could not only give you things that were thought-provoking, but also he would also, say, this is the goal, this is where we're trying to head, and think about yourself, and then how is what you're doing aligned with aiming for that goal.
Good.
I know there were many times when we would go home, and Dee Dee and I would be talking about it as we're driving home from the church.
Yeah.
And so I said, it doesn't matter what he was teaching or preaching on. We would a lot of times go home talking about what does that really mean and how does that affect us.
Good. So
That's very important.
there's an introspection. There's a no matter what happens in any situation, both good and bad, it calls you to reflect on how that affects you. Good. And I talked about this earlier, and let me just say this. Earlier, like one of our first classes, the primary thing we talked about was Christ and Christ's authority position. And Christ was very against power. In fact, he would argue maybe that the best way to show power is to give it up. That there is this emptiness to it, that there's a sacrificial aspect of it, right? I think that's the strongest way that Jesus was able to offer up authority to the world was the cross, which in the world's eyes is the least authoritarian move that you could make. That's a very degrading. It's just embarrassing, and it's weakness in the world's eyes, but it became strength for the Christian. Yeah. 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 Sure. Good. So, and that brings me up to my next point. You're amazing. You're reading my mind, which is knowing the shepherd, this relationship between, this is the last thing I want to bring up about shepherd, then we're going to move on. But that is a challenge for us, is how do we hear the voice of the shepherd, and how does the shepherd hear the voice of the sheep, right? Because I think that's easily developed in smaller churches. Some of us grew up in rural churches, and it's evident that that was easier in early Christianity when folks would gather in homes. The largest church maybe would have been 40 people. And so in that sense, it was good. So how does this idea of knowing the flock and how does this apply to larger churches like our own that pushes 400 plus on a Sunday morning, and probably much larger even in the roll sheet? Yeah. So, this connects. So, leading the charge is what Joseph and elders should be able to do. And I think this works for a 30-person member church and a 400-member church, because if you're modeling or exemplifying life in Christ, then I think people are going to be able to see and witness that to some extent. It may only be 15, 20 people at first, but it does have a ripple effect, like all things in life does, right? And so if you are living a morally, socially, ethically good life, and you're not even a Christian, let's just say, we'll just pick on somebody like that, then that's evident at the workspace, that's evident in family life, that's just evident that that's a good human being. Well, that on top of that, if you have found salvation in Christ, that should be the same case. And so, of course, we would hope that our leaders exemplify that they themselves kind of take the charge into leading what it means to be by example, by how they live, how they walk, how they talk, and all that. Good. What else? Let's talk about some of the negative implications. I mean, how do you take this knowing your elder because let's just be honest, I mean, knowingness is a layered thing, right? Is knowingness me as the preacher walking the aisles, and this is not a shallow endeavor, by the way. This is a good thing, but it's hard for me to really know every single one of you, right? And so, Carl, Marilyn, I kind of know them. We shake hands. We've done potlucks together. I might even sat next to them one time at a potluck. We shake hands. I just had dinner with Joe and Jana, though, at their house a couple weeks ago, and we made a connection early on because of family relatives back in the day. And so this is nothing against Carl and Marilyn. They don't see this as me hurting their feelings, but I probably know Joe and Jana a little better than I know the Jenkins. But even though I know you, let's just be honest, I know my wife even more than that. So there's levels of knowingness. Does that make sense? I was trying to suggest, when are you going to invite me over so I can eat your food? Yeah, I mean, if you didn't get the clue, that was about as obvious as it came. Yeah. So food's always good. So question. So why do we use knowing somebody as a primary trait in identifying an elder, when the truth of the matter is it's very hard to know every single one of our elders? Mary. Sure. Yeah. That's good. That's good. It's amazing how I can have some presuppositions about someone. We've all got in trouble with this. I mean, this is just human nature, right? Where I think I've got Rita figured out. She thinks she's got me figured out. And then we spend some time together. And then I was like, oh, man, I completely had Rita I did not have her figured out at all, I thought she was super shy and quiet. And then you get to know her. Man, she doesn't stop talking. I'm just kidding. Anyways, you know what I'm saying. So there's a couple hands. I see Carolyn's. I think there was one over here, but go ahead, Carolyn. Good, yeah. So Carolyn's talking about the position of an elder, and one thing is sometimes elders do a poor job in communicating and articulating what the church should know, and sometimes the church does a poor job in what it actually should know in response and reaction towards what the leadership is talking about, which I think is a good point. Which I think to me the deeper issue is why do we in general speak, just generally speaking, why is our first response towards leadership and power more about suspicion than about trust? Am I the only one where, I mean, maybe it's my generation, but for a baseball coach, that first couple days of practice, I'm suspicious of you until I finally figure out that you're a good baseball coach. And if you're not, in my eyes, then I'll try to listen to you, but I just really want to have a good season. I'm just trying to pick on a young person, but there is a level of suspicion we have towards positions of authority, and that's seen not just in church, that's seen in government and in schools and principal. I mean, it's seen in a lot of different ways, I think. So, I see. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Good. And so I think part of the call for the elder, though, their responsibility in this, I would call it a crisis in our society and culture, because it really is. I mean, we are so, I see you, I don't want you to, but we are in a crisis right now as a society, and Christians have an opportunity maybe to witness to the world to say, look, we need to figure out a way to understand the value of mutual submission. And mutual submission would be both elders submitting to the church and the church submitting to um, the elders. And there's other aspects of life where, as an employee, I submit to my employer. I should show and honor that and have that with integrity. And the list goes on. Husband, wife, husband, other relationships. And so I think you're right. I think there's an opportunity for us to witness the good news of Jesus and how we respond and react towards both healthy but also unhealthy authority positions, and how we respond is important, I think. So, I'm sorry, Dee Dee. Sure. Good. Okay, thanks. We're going to move on. So there's other hands. Sorry, John, I saw, but we're going to have to move on just for the sake of time. So if I offended you, I'm kind of sorry. But what Dee Dee was saying, I think there are two good points. One is recognizing, first off, that we just have to at least identify that we are kind of a more entitled society, and we've raised our kids to be a little more entitled, and now we're going to have to deal with that. That's a long 15-year conversation, and so we're just living in the middle of that. The second one, though, which is the so what. So what are the implications of this, the shepherding? And I think you brought up some good practical ways that we could consider this as we move forward as a church, is how can we make our leadership, ministers, elders more available in the lives of people? And churches have done it in a variety of ways, and you just mentioned one of them. One of them you mentioned was assigning elders to specific groups. That especially works when you have larger elder groups, so like 20 plus, and I've been in churches with 20 plus, but it can still work when you have an eldership that's a smaller elder group. We just have to be creative in how we do that. That's why life groups, one of the reasons why I value and appreciate what life groups are trying to do. That's a very intimate setting, and I know our elders are participating in that. I know Victor leads one. I know Jake is one in Seguin. I know Tom does the one here, and I know Joe does one in Canyon Lake. And so that's one example. I know that I participate with the Simmons and the Hammonds, Lancaster. So we all are kind of trying to figure out smaller community. Then we do that in Sunday morning class. Some of our elders teach. And but there's more ways to do it. And so what are the practical implications? How can we create ways to invite our elders to get to know not only the body more, but also guests more, new members who've been around for a long time, even the local community. I mean, if we really want our leadership to identify what our local mission is, they need to know the city around them or the cities around them, since we are a kind of a commuter church. And so how do we do that in ways? And so that's important. And so appreciate that. We'll talk about that more hopefully in the future. Okay, so you can kind of turn over to the pastoral letters of Timothy and Titus, 1 Timothy and Titus. We'll spend 15 minutes just on a rough overview, and then we'll talk more specifically about what Paul and Titus and Timothy are up to with these churches in the coming weeks. Previous weeks we emphasized in some ways that the church is like other communities that require leadership. For example, I think it's interesting, but in today's society, we try to differentiate and distinct Christian leaders from secular leaders. But what Paul was doing when he used words like shepherd and elder and bishop and all those words, he's actually using secular leadership words and pulled them into the church. So interesting to know, one way that Paul was trying to bridge some gap between the world and through the Christian message was to identify secular words that the world could identify with. Okay? Now so this is a bad example, and we would never do this, but it would be like, okay, calling your elder a CEO or something like that. I mean, we would never do that because of the implications of that. But the point is you take some type of word that was used in the secular world, and then you would kind of bring it into the Christian community. That was a very common dimension and use that Paul did. Even the basic word of church, right? Ecclesios is kind of what you would find at a local market. And so Paul was interested in identifying what people know about everyday life, and he thought that was important for the church as well. So Christians, in some ways, avoid secular forms of leadership, though, and so this is where it happens, right? So we avoid secular forms of leadership, power and authority and abuse and all those different things, and yet we're also trying to make a connection because part of our witness, if you are a leader in the secular world, part of your witness is to say, look, not all leadership and authority is bad, right? You can be a principal and not be a jerk. And you can respect and honor and treat your employees with integrity and honor, and you can actually live out your Christian life, and I think I had this conversation in ways that kind of speak to the fact that you're a Christian. The danger, though, right, is when you have Christian posters and crosses on your desk. I think those are you, Alan, right? I knew I was talking to somebody about this, and yet in all ways of life, you're not a Christian at all. You say you're a Christian, and everybody knows you go to church, but you're actually a pretty poor human being, right? And so Paul's trying to figure that out and discuss that with the people. And so he does believe, though, that the church leadership is countercultural. The names are connected and familiar, but it's different. Okay? And so he's using that as a way to get people to at least start a conversation. So Jesus modeled and taught true leadership. And for Jesus, it was sacrificial, right? Mark 10:45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. And in the letters of Paul, we saw that leadership occurs with every Christian, right? And so we talked about that. We talked about the body of Christ, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and how every Christian in some way or another has a call to lead into something. And so there's this one anotherness involved in the local church. But eventually, after we see that title, or function, precedes title, 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, we do begin as a Christian movement, we do begin giving special attention to offices. And these offices are described, this is what we're going to talk about, described in 1 Timothy and Titus. And these are models that we would argue are for all ages. Okay? And so we target specific offices, and there's some good things we're going to talk about with this passage with that, and there are some things that we need to bring up that the passage itself reveals that we sometimes neglect or at least ignore. And I think bringing up both the tension but also the blessing helps us identify how leaders ought to be and should be. So in both letters, Titus and Timothy, Paul assumes that he will not be present to guide these churches. They're on their own. For the 1 Timothy book, it's the churches in Ephesus. He knows them very well. He's been around them a lot, but he has been called to do some other things. And so he sends Timothy as kind of an emissary. And he's been with Timothy for a while. Timothy's been with Paul for, at this point, probably 10, 15 years, has a good relationship with him. So Timothy knows Paul very well. We don't know as much about Titus, but we know he's also an important person. And one of the key differences of the Timothy context and the Titus context is this. Timothy, meaning Ephesus, is the fourth largest city in Rome. And it's a huge hub of culture, of gods, polytheism, all these different things. And it's a place where a lot of Christianity was able to spread itself out. I mean, that was kind of one of the main supporting hubs for even Paul's journey. And so because of that, Paul's understanding of that church is different than the Titus church. And you will see that in the list. And I think that's important. We'll talk about this more in coming weeks. But the lists are slightly different. And we're going to explain why I think that is important. But we'll get to that here in just a little bit later. So Timothy and Titus are not residential ministers. Timothy is not the local preacher of Ephesus. He was somebody that was sent by Paul. He was part of an envoy, if you will, of Paul's instructions. And so these letters are what they resemble. I guess another way to say it is, what these letters resemble is maybe this ancient administrative letter. You almost can sense that in the reading. It almost reads differently, right, than Colossians or even Ephesians itself. It's kind of listed and clearly articulated and defined, and it's not like lots of thoughtful theological reflection, and it's very clear and concise because it actually mimics or looks like a letter back in the ancient world that would be kind of an administrative letter that you would send to some organization or community that needs some help. Okay? And so that's important to know that because of how the style of writing, what the style of writing is and how it's written and all those different things. So for 1 Timothy, right? So in 1 Timothy, he assumes leadership roles. So he lists out leadership roles throughout this letter. And he includes bishops, 1 Timothy chapter 3. He includes deacons, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 8, he includes women. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 11, and they either could be, depending on your translation, either be wives or women. That's a different conversation. Also, one that we often don't talk about, he includes widows. Like a widow was an office position. And that's read that, 1 Timothy 5, 3 through 16. And so for 1 Timothy, he lists out, and then of course elders are mentioned again, 5 verses 17. And so we assume that the elders listed in chapter 1, 5:17 are the same as the bishops or elders talked about in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Okay. Titus mentions only elders. Okay, so Titus church only has elders, and the Ephesus church has elders, deacons, widows, a couple different levels of maybe what we would call offices. That's an appropriate word. And Titus only mentions elders. In 1 Timothy 3, Paul assumes that people are already familiar with these offices, while Titus is told to ordain or bless or affirm elders in every city in Crete. So in one book, you see that this letter is written as if they've already assumed and already know that there's elders. In another book, it's like, okay, you don't have elders, we need to get some. And I think there's some reasons for that. I don't think Ephesus is an older planted church, but not by no stretch means, but at least in the Christian known world, Ephesus was definitely a more of a planted and mainstream, and it was one of the local churches everybody knew about, way more so than the church in Crete. And so it would had some influence. It was already somewhat established. With that, there were some problems and issues. With that, there were some blessings. And with Crete, it was just a new church plant. And so you will see again, once again, some differences. So here we go. This form of leadership, meaning elder, was common in the ancient world. And we talked about this already, but needs to be invited and mentioned again, right? Leaders by elders was common in the synagogues and was also common in really any kind of pre-industrialized society, and even today, right? If you go to an underdeveloped nation, this whole concept of elder is still a very dominant form of localized leaders. Okay? That doesn't say it's archaic. It doesn't mean it's old and ancient, and it just means that in the ancient world, that was the most identified form of leadership, especially at the local level. And because it was ancient, it would be pre-industrialized, and because it was pre-industrialized, there would still be nations today, though underdeveloped, that still practice that form of leadership. That doesn't mean, though, that what I'm suggesting is that industrialized modern day folks can't still use that form of leadership. Does that make sense? We can still, but we just have to recognize where it came from and how it was developed. All right, that's a fire hose of generic information, but let me finish off with this, and I got 4 minutes. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, so if you turn to 1 Timothy chapter 1, Paul is describing the crisis. And I thought I had my book there, but and the crisis is, here it is right here, is false teachers. And so let me read this to you real quick. I urge you, as I did when I was on my way to Macedonia, to remain in Ephesus so that you may instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine, and not to occupy themselves with myths and endless genealogies that promote speculations rather than the divine training from pure heart, a good conscience, a sincere faith. Some people, teachers of the law, without understanding either that they are saying or the things about which they make assertions. So there is a crisis brewing in Timothy with false teachers. And so one of the functions that precedes title of the office of elder is to combat or help a church navigate through false teaching. Okay? So that's one of the primary roles for the church. Paul instructs Titus to ordain elders because of the critical situation posed by false teachers. Titus 1:10 through 16. Again, we see for both Timothy and Titus, one common thread is this idea of false teachers. And so, let me end with this, and then we'll talk more, we'll kind of unpack this later. These instructions remind us, right, that the church faces new challenges every generation. We have new challenges every generation, right? And that itself, those challenges themselves. So I would say part of what it means, a false teacher, so instead of just identifying a human being and, I've already picked on Carl already, so instead of just being a church and rally ourselves against Carl and say, hey, Carl's a false teacher, let's get him out. I think it's bigger than that. I think part of the idea, the umbrella of false teachers is the challenges that we face today and identifying what our identity is in the midst of these challenges. And we could probably, if we had a whiteboard, we could probably list at least 100 challenges that churches face in the 21st century that churches did not face even 30 years ago. Or a list of what churches 30 years ago had to face that churches did not face 60 years ago. And the list goes on and on and on. And so I think the appointment of leaders in the local church is not simply, and nothing against 1 Timothy, because I think it's speaking more to than this. It's not simply to fill out an organizational chart. It's way more than that. But it's actually inviting men and their families. It's inviting them to help us discern and determine our future mission identity. To be able to face the challenges that we are facing today and invite the church. That's where we invite the church, Carolyn, about communication. Invite the church into that discernment, into that conversation. And so one of the reasons why I think it's so exciting to have our current elder selection process that's coming up, it gives us a chance as a church to talk about in what ways is the church today in time of transition? In what ways is the church facing challenges that churches have not faced before? In what ways is the church different today than it was even a generation ago? And in all of that, how can we prayerfully and confidently raise up new elders that God has called to lead us into that new mission? That has always been the case for the local church, and it's part of what we do in the elder selection process.